I wanted to talk a little bit about the discussion surrounding tariffs, because that's been kind of all the news has thought about for a little while. We have stock market crashes happening. We have all sorts of chatter going on surrounding that. And what I was thinking about with this is, when you're a manager in a workplace, it's easy to think to yourself that you're going to go out there and you're going to do all of the work yourself. Because maybe it's easier to just go do a job than it is to teach someone else how to do the job, or to hold someone else accountable to do the job correctly. So you can wind up just being overloaded with a lot of things that you're trying to do, a lot of manual labor sort of things you're trying to do, when really you should be motivating your team. You should be encouraging your team to be their best. You shouldn't be trying to prove that you're able to do all of it yourself. And when I see all of the discussion surrounding trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States, and a lot of the things that essentially fall under the banner of protectionism, that's kind of the allegory that I'm reminded of. It's sort of like, in a way, we as the United States, or as maybe the collective West even, have started to have this attitude that we want to go back to a sort of an industrialized way of living. And that's not to say that we shouldn't produce things of all different sorts in the economy, but there's a lot of different ways you can add value in the world. There's consultancy services, there's intellectual property, there's things that are developed in the technology space, there's educational commodities which are exported in the form of colleges which are teaching international students. There's lots of different things that a country can export other than just toaster ovens and cheap consumer goods. Not to say that there aren't some valid concerns surrounding trade imbalances, but what if we sort of have this crisis of intellectual and moral leadership? And so instead of being a beacon in the world that focuses on encouraging others to develop, encouraging others to be their best, in a sense pursuing a philosophy which tries to create a universal tide that lifts all boats, instead of that, we just want to, make our own toaster ovens and TVs ourselves and close ourselves off to the outside world and say intellectual values don't matter anymore. We don't care about anything unless it's something that's very concrete that you can hold in your hand. And, we kind of go to, I guess a sort of a backward track, where we're not trying to move into the future. We're trying to emulate things from the 19th century or something, because, it worked in the pre-industrial version of the United States. So therefore, let's go back to that. And I look at society and I see kind of a trend which would support a lot of this sort of a premise that I'm talking about here. There's people who don't really have very much understanding of how the world works, just on a basic level. There's a lack of intellectual capacity in a lot of people in our society. And when you have a lot of people who are very ignorant, and they start to have that attitude that they don't want to work on themselves, they just want some sort of a doctrine that will allow them to say that they are the victim of the broader world. For example, in some countries, you're more likely to find people who are bilingual, probably because there's multiple different primary languages which are spoken in their respective countries. So if you go to Canada, maybe you would find people who might be able to speak a bit of French and a bit of English, and they could speak both because there's French and there's English, both broadly spoken in that country, or something of that nature. And then you look at the average American, and we like to say things like, well, make English the official language of the United States. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be. But what part of that comes from a place of just being lazy, just saying, you know what, I don't want to have to learn another language. I don't want to have to do anything other than, eat my potato chips in front of the big screen TV that I got cheap from the Walmart while I become fatter and fatter and watch football. That's what you want to do. So you view learning another language or something like that as a threat to your lifestyle, in a sense, perhaps, right? So it all adds up to this sort of an attitude that seems to prevail in our society today, that anything that might make us need to change in some way, we would rather villainize that and then proceed to say, we need to fight against it. So instead of being more literate or more intellectual, we'd rather try to replicate a 19th century industrial revolution or return to an agrarian way of life. It's not probably a coincidence that there's a lot of the doom and gloom prepping sort of people who sort of have a fantasy about the world falling apart and going back to a simple lifestyle of raising chickens and growing carrots in the backyard and thriving in a bartering economy. Why? Because they don't feel like they have a place in a more intellectual economy, and so they want to regress. It's kind of like somebody who's overextended with their credit card debt, and then they want to, maybe they like it if other people are suddenly suffering. There's something terrible that has happened. People like to see others suffering because they have been suffering for a long time as the result of their own personal misdeeds. And so if a disaster that everyone shares comes along, then suddenly they are not as alone. And so I think these are important things for us to safeguard ourselves from by trying to be a bit more intellectual, a bit more ecumenical, a bit more inclined to focus on the sorts of things which will lift up all boats, instead of just trying to get ahead for our own selves without any particular regard to the welfare and the progress of the wider world. Now, I also wanted to talk a little bit about free markets and why I believe that they are important. Now, let's take China as an example. When you look at China, they are a communist country, and yet they produce a lot of things in China which are sold broadly to the rest of the world. So even if it's a communist country by name, officially, it's a very capitalistic, free market country too, because it's very much connected to global free trade. So what happens when you have a country which might have more authoritarian or autocratic tendencies, but it's well connected to a world that is engaged extensively in free trade? Well, you wind up with a situation where people have a little bit more opportunity and a little bit more liberty there. Even if the country isn't perfect, it's still part of the world that is greater than its own borders. And so when a country is connected in that way, it tends to be more ecumenical. It tends to be more inclined to drift in the direction of civil liberties and individual rights and improving the general standard of living for everyone, even if it doesn't happen to the degree we would hope, or it doesn't happen immediately. Being part of a network is better than being in a silo all by yourself. And to illustrate what I'm saying here a little bit better, it's kind of like a man who might be an abusive husband, and he doesn't treat his wife very well, he doesn't treat his family very well. And imagine if there's a lot of guests, there's a lot of friends that are coming over, there's a lot of other people that are in his family's life. It's not just him. Well, he's going to behave a lot better when he knows that there's a network that his family is part of. He's going to behave himself a lot better when he knows that they are not alone, because there's other eyes that are watching. There's other people who are going to know what happens. But now let's just say, hypothetically, that all of those other people, all of his wife's friends and his family's friends, all of these people who were coming over and going in and out and visiting all the time, they say, you know what, we're going to go on strike against you. We don't like you. We don't believe in your lifestyle, and we're not going to come over anymore. We're not going to have anything to do with you. So now you have this abusive man, and you have him in a silo with his family, and they're all by themselves. They're at his mercy, and no one is there to know what's going on. No one is there to be an advocate or to be a moderating force. And then after a while, you're going to find that the effects of this are very negative for everyone involved. The abusive man becomes more abusive. His family becomes more abused. And there's fewer opportunities for any of the people involved to be pushed in a direction of being better or more moderate or more safe. And that's one example of why it's important for us not to go down the path of celebrating things which erode our connected network of free markets and free trade around the world. Now, to touch a little bit on the recent Trump tariff situation, I think it's important to talk about honesty. And as far as I can tell, I'm not an economist, so I don't really know, but just from my layman's perspective, it looks like what we have done as a country when we start talking about imposing tariffs and things like that is to really use the wrong vocabulary, use the wrong verbiage, and not really be honest with the American people or even with the world about what we are doing. Because, to illustrate this, Trump has this list of all of the supposed tariffs that other countries have, and at the top of the list it says China has a tariff rate of 67%. And so therefore we're going to impose an added tariff on China of 34% for all goods, which is half of the 67. So on the surface, since this is all presented as a reciprocal tariff, you'd say, well, okay, if China is charging us 67% tax on everything that we get from them, then I guess it would only be fair that we charge them half of that and impose our own 34% tax in return. That would seem pretty fair if that were true. But it's not true, though, because what we're actually talking about is trade imbalances, not tariffs. And so while the United States is saying it's going to impose, say, a 34% added tariff on China, which I think adds up to something more like 54%, because there already had been a 20% tariff added recently in the last few weeks. So we're going to have this very high tariff rate, but the reality is there is no 67% China tariff on the United States. There's a trade imbalance, which means that we buy more things, we import more things from China than China imports for itself from us. So in simple terms, we buy more from China than China buys from us. And so in Trump's view, it would appear that his idea is that essentially if China exports to us twice as much as we export to them, then in his mind, that's that's something in the neighborhood of a 100% effective foreign tariff, something like that. So it's really kind of a simple sort of janky math that's being used to determine the perception on the part of the United States of currency manipulation or trade unfairness on the part of other countries. But what we're saying is it's a reciprocal tariff, when really it's just an arbitrary tariff that we're imposing on a foreign power because there is a trade imbalance. So let's think about that a little bit more. What do we get out of a trade imbalance with China? Well, we get all of those things that fall into the ballpark of a cheap TV that seems like, it's pretty amazing to get a 55-inch TV for $200 or something like that. And so if we go down this path and we say, well, we've been ripped off and it's unfair, well, then pretty soon the American people will get to experience fairness. They will get to experience what it's like when they have to pay full price for products which are manufactured in the United States, which might be more expensive and also inferior. And suddenly a lot of these people that like to be warriors on Reddit, I would suspect when the price of a TV doubles, they're going to have some consternation and concern, especially if their 401k is a lot poorer as well. But then I think back to that illustration I opened with. It's sort of like the manager that says, you know what, I'm going to do all the work myself because I don't believe in any of the other employees and they're not any good anyway. So he antagonizes them, and then they all disappear. And now there are no employees left. There's no one there. It's just the manager left, and he realizes, you know what, I'm one guy, and now I am going to be held accountable to somehow complete the work of the 300 people that I drove away with my arrogance and hubris because I wanted to tell them that they weren't worth having around, and then they called my bluff and they headed out and just left me there. And sometimes in life it seems like there's a certain degree of poetic justice which happens, where maybe you don't want bad things to happen, but when you see people that are being very judgmental about all the different things they think are wrong with the world and all of that sort of thing, and you see that they seem like they're not very intellectual, they're not very well informed, they believe lies readily, and then they hate being victims. Well, sometimes if people victimize other people all the time and then they become the victim at some point, you don't really feel sorry for them, because the truth is they're more just a victim of themselves. And I do think, to some degree, somewhere in all of the economic corrections and things that happen that we talk about, there's a truth that if you want to complain too much about how unfair the world is, someone might listen to you and they might make the world a little bit more fair. And you might find in that moment that you regret asking so much for things to be more fair, because you are going to realize that it doesn't work out as well for you as you thought it would. Because sometimes when you uncover corruption, if you uncover all of it, you'll find the people who were clamoring the loudest, demanding that corruption be uncovered, are actually just as corrupt themselves. So, we say the United States has been ripped off by the rest of the world. Maybe it has. Maybe it has. But I also think that all of those cheap goods made in China that we all like to buy, well, if you look at it from a certain perspective, maybe you could say that we have been ripping off the rest of the world, because their labor has made it possible for us to, in a sense, have a higher standard of living for less effort here at home. So, what can we do to wrap up? Well, we can be a little bit less defined by consumerism. We can live simpler lives. We can get out of debt. We can be good stewards of the lives that we have economically, and that'll help us weather the storm. We can also invest in our own education. And by that, I don't mean go back to college or something like that. I just mean learn something new every day. Be open to considering perspectives which maybe are different from the ones that you have always had. Be open to being corrected, because no matter how much you think you have all the answers, the truth is the people who are the wisest are usually the ones who aren't too sure that they're right all the time. Be a little bit more pragmatic, be more willing to learn something instead of just looking for more ideas that support your established worldview. If you tend to look at conservative news outlets, then why don't you mix some liberal ones in with that? If you're more inclined to be a liberal, then maybe diversify what you consume with a little bit more from the other side of the aisle. Maybe, spend a little bit less time getting your news from YouTube and a little bit more time getting your news from a news magazine or something that has balanced analysis and more depth to it. Try to be a person who practices lifelong learning. It doesn't mean that you have to know everything. You truly do not need to know everything. It's just about getting to a point where we celebrate truth instead of just blindly looking for things that will prop up our own pre-existing notions and perspectives. To be more pragmatic, as a citizen of the world, and to think less about trying to get ahead and more about doing things that will do good and produce value and quality in the world. We should focus less on things that make us look good and focus more on things which actually do good, both in our lives and in the lives of others. And as with all things in the world, we should focus a bit less on all of the parts that we can't control, like geopolitical things at a macro level, and focus more on the parts of life which truly are in our control, namely the way we spend each of our days. As always, life has loveliness to sell, so buy it and never count the cost. As always, thanks for watching.